what we'll do here is we're taking a look at Mark 9:44 and Mark 9:46. And just for a little bit of context here, let me grab the NKJV here, and we'll read it together, just so you know what we're talking about here. All right, so I'll give you a couple verses ahead of time. So Mark 9:42 and on. So it's, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed rather than having two hands to go to hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched, where their worm does not die and their fire is not quenched. Okay, that's missing in our modern Bible translations. Then we go to 9:45, and if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed rather than having 2 feet to be cast into hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched, where their worm does not die and their fire is not quenched. And 46 here, okay, this is not in the modern English Bibles. Now, if we continue reading 47, and if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of heaven with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire, where, 9:48, their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. So this one here in verse 48, it's not contested. So in the manuscript tradition, verse 48 is there. There's no question about it. Like we look at all the manuscripts, it has it, generally speaking. I'm sure there's probably some variant or something, but unmistakably, right, this is a reference back to the end of Isaiah. In Isaiah 66, where it basically damns those who won't follow after God. And it uses this exact phrase. So when it says their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, right, whoever's listening to this is hearing that phrase echoed from Isaiah. So we're talking about prophecy here. So yeah, there's definitely a link back to the prophet Isaiah with this phrase. Now, why this is interesting, it's because the 2 phrases before, like we mentioned, verse 46 and verse 44, in our modern English Bibles, it's listed as not being in the modern English Bibles. So most of your Alexandrian manuscripts are typically not going to have this. Now, I haven't surveyed the evidence for it entirely yet, just kind of like took a quick gloss, because we'll probably focus on that next week. Generally speaking, this is going to be a Byzantine reading. So when we see their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, this is going to be a majority text. It's in the Textus Receptus. You're going to see it in the Byzantine text form, the Hodges Farstad. I believe F35 has it. I'll have to double check that really quick while we're here. Yeah, 44 and 46 has it there. And of course 48. So F35 has it. So basically all your Byzantine texts contain it, and then all your critical text says, no, I don't really think we're going to have it there. Now the question is, well, who's right? Right? This is the word of God. We want to know who's right. So I'm a Byzantine prioritist, so I would typically stick with leading these in because of that. You're going to determine how the evidence is weighed based on your presuppositions, and one of my presuppositions, and I don't have any issue with admitting that, is that God used the Greek church to preserve the Greek scriptures. And so here is what we have. That's leaving aside the question of whether or not other translations can be used to preserve the text. But we're not going to go there today. So these are the passages in question. Now, as has kind of become commentary, it just works really well. We're going to take a look at a couple other English Bible translations to see what they do with these 2 passages. So the NASB. Okay, so we have where their worm does not die and their fire is not quenched. It's in, square brackets. So the NASB basically says, well, we don't think it's scripture. That's why they put square brackets around. You can see same thing in verse 46. So we have a footnote here. So verse 44 and 46, which are identical to verse 48, are not found in the early manuscripts. Okay, and of course we know that. So Aleph and B, Codex Delta, Codex L, Codex C doesn't have it. We'll see that in a little bit. Let's pop over to ESV. See what the ESV is saying here in Mark 9:44. Here's the first one. So verse 9. So it'll be the same for the verse 46. So this is why this one's interesting, because it's 2 verses, but they're the exact same wording. So anyway, it says some manuscripts add verse 44 and 46, which are identical with verse 48. That seems really close to the NASB note. This one doesn't say early, just says some manuscripts. Okay, I could go with that. NIV, so 44 is in square brackets, at least the number is. Some manuscript include here the words of verse 8, so they must have the same note for 46 right here. Some manuscripts include here the words of verse 48. Okay, or we can go with some manuscripts. Yeah, this one is, I mean, if you're coming from a modern textual critical perspective, this one's a lot more difficult because the weight of the evidence is interesting. And we'll take a look at that in a moment here. So this is which one is this? The NRSV. I don't particularly like the NRSV, but it's worth seeing what modern scholarship is saying. Verse 44 and 46, which are identical to verse 48, are lacking in the best and ancient authorities. The best. It's the best. I love it. If you know where that's from, right? No, but are they really the best? Are they really the best, right? And of course, the question is well, why do we put so much weight on Sinaiticus and Vaticanus? We've talked about this a bit before. Now, there's a few other manuscripts in there, aside from just those two. But again, generally speaking, we see this throughout the Byzantine tradition. So yeah, the best ancient authorities. Now, again, normally we would be looking at just Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, or Aleph and B. But I think there's a few more manuscripts here that don't contain these two passages. Okay, NLT. Very popular Bible translation in the Pentecostal circles. But let's see what the footnote says on these verses here. 943b. Some manuscripts add verse 44, where the maggots never die and the fire never goes out. Okay. And then C948, which is basically the same thing. Yeah, same thing. Let's pop over to the CSB. Okay, so they skip the verse entirely, just like the other passage, or just like the other translations. Some manuscripts include 44, where their worm does not die and their fire is not quenched. And then at the end of 46, we have the same thing. Some manuscripts include. Again, I think some manuscripts for a note is justifiable here. So I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that note. That footnote seems to be fairly accurate, as vague as it is. Then the NET translation. The NET translation, this is the one we like because it's got a really big set of notes. But they are definitely slanted toward a critical text position. So if we go to 943, the end of 943 here, gives us a bit of a bigger note. So here it is. Here's a lot of the details. So it says, most later manuscripts have 944 here and 946 after verse 45, where their worm never dies and fire is never quenched. Identical with verse 48. So verse 44 and 46 are present in Alexandrinus, Codex D, Theta, Family 13, the majority, the Latin manuscripts, the Syriac, that's the Peshitta and the Herclean. But they're lacking in the most important Alexandrian manuscripts. And again, this comes down to your typical Alexandrian versus Byzantine reading. And that's essentially what it is. If it's Byzantine, you have it. If it's Alexandrian, you don't. And if it's Assyrian and Western, I think it's kind of mixed here. So lacking in important Alexandrian manuscripts and several others. So Aleph, B, C, L, W, Delta, C, 0274, F1, 28, and a whole bunch of other ones. Now, this is interesting. This is interesting because there's some witnesses that we have in the ECM that they've listed as not pertaining to keeping these two passages in Scripture, but they shouldn't be. I don't think they should be listed as witnesses either for or against, and we'll take a look at that because it's super interesting. But anyway, so it goes on to say, this appears to be a scribal addition from verse 48 and is almost certainly not originally part of the Greek text of Mark. The present translation follows NA in omitting the verse number, a procedure also followed by a number of other modern translations. So the claim here, and again, this is lifted almost verbatim from Metzger's commentary, that this appears to be a scribal addition from verse 48 and is almost certainly not original. So a scribal addition from verse 48. So they're suggesting that when a scribe was copying this, for some reason, he looked at verse 48 and copied that over into verse 46 and verse 44 to break it up. And I think I read somewhere that maybe this was possibly done to smooth out some of the literature and have three equal parts. Or again, it's not entirely clear how this happens, right? To explain how this gets entered into the text is very difficult. from my perspective. Now we can look at this and maybe plausibly come up with some potential reasons why this is a difficult variant or difficult inclusion based on the internal evidence. But because it's internal evidence, right, it's subject to a little bit more bias, I guess. Like, for example, if we come back over to the text, I'll give you an example of how this internal evidence could potentially work in favor of its removal. Now, I don't believe it's to be removed, but how it could be in favor. If you take a look at these verses here, you look at 43 and look how it ends. Right? If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed rather than having 2 hands to go to hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched. So he's already saying in verse 43, like I'm playing the part of I'm playing the advocate of the critical text. Okay, he's already talking about hell and fire. Why would he have to mention it again? Right? To go to hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched. And then why is he repeating it again? Their worm does not die, and their fire is not quenched. Okay, but then the same thing happens again in verse 45. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame rather than having 2 feet to be cast into hell, into a fire that shall never be quenched, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Now that wouldn't make sense to have verse 46 there, because, he's already mentioning hell and fire in the previous verse. He's really duplicating things up here. So really what it is, it's clearly at the end of the passage, because, in 48, that's the end of the whole pericope. And so that's clearly where it's supposed to. Now that might be how some sort of reference to an internal argument would go. So I would counter that. And how I would counter that would be this, is that he's not just simply saying their worm does not die and their fire is not quenched, right? That it's not just simply saying that to say, hey, if you don't get this stuff sorted out in your life, you got this going on. No. It's a reference back to Isaiah. So each time he gives us a bit of wisdom here, right? And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. Each time he references back to Isaiah for why it's so important to, quote, cut off your foot, gouge out your eye, right? Or what was the first one here? To cut off your hand, right? Why is he talking so extreme? Because, there's, if your whole body is going to go to hell, into a fire that shouldn't be quenched. And then Jesus is backing up this point by going, look, it's not just me saying this here right now. It's prophesied in Isaiah. And so the careful reader would understand that this is not just simply Jesus saying this to them while he's teaching them. This is prophecy coming out as well. So I think by having it there at all 3 places, it's reinforcing the importance of what he's teaching there. Now that's coming from an internal mindset, right? That's at least how I would defend the repetition there. And repetition like that is it's not foreign to the scriptures. We see that frequently enough. All right, so let's continue on here. So what I did here is I started taking a look at manuscripts. What I always do here is I always get my so cool, the spreadsheets. So I got my spreadsheet out and I started recording down manuscripts. And all of these down here are listed as omissions in the ECM. So I've got a few highlighted here. It's interesting how all of these manuscripts make it into the ECM listing. And it really just kind of bolsters, or at least it appears to bolster the amount of support for the removal of these passages. But it's really interesting because a number of these, and I'll highlight them really quickly, are so interesting that they ought to be removed entirely from the witness list. Now, of course, these are a bit later because most of these are minuscules, right? The support that goes typically for its removal would be Aleph, B, so Sinaiticus Vaticanus, Codex C, Ephraemi Rescriptus. These are all the early ones, right? Regius, Codex L, Washingtonianus, Codex Delta. That's that really cool manuscript. That's like a Greek-Latin diglot, and Codex C. And so these ones basically are saying, no, we don't think that it should be in there, or it doesn't show us that it's in there. I haven't yet taken a look at it to see if there were any notes or anything, but I did find one that had a note in it. But yeah, so where it gets interesting is when you start looking at the minuscules, the later ones. So these ones here that I'm highlighting, these are manuscripts which contain a commentary alongside them. So typically, what often happens, well, not what often happens, but many times in the manuscript tradition, what you get is a manuscript that isn't just a New Testament. It's a commentary included with the New Testament. And in these examples, the Theophylact commentary, he typically would write some commentary, and then that would be separated, and then the next bit would be the text of the scriptures, and then he would take the text of the scriptures, and then underneath it he would write a commentary on that, and then he would just repeat this over and over again to whatever when he felt he wrote enough. But these commentaries here, which I'm highlighting as I'm talking here, are very interesting, because some of these, they don't just miss verse 44 and 46. What they do is they remove everything between 44 and 46. So in these examples, they stop at 44, 45, and 46, not included, and then they resume at 47. I found one, which a scribe got a little bit too carried away, and continued at verse 48 instead of verse 47. But this one is an Alexandrian manuscript. I could probably make this bigger. It was an Alexandrian manuscript that contained this removal. And when you see this removal, it's really interesting, because it does imply that the verses were all together. And when you take homoteleuton and parablepsis into account, it makes total sense as to why these verses were removed. Anyway, so where I'm going with this is these minuscule manuscripts that contain the commentary, and it's basically specifically the commentary, remove all of the verses between 44 and 46 and resume at 47. They don't just remove where their worm dies and where their worm dies and their fire is not quenched. They don't just remove that section. They remove that entire second bit of information. So super interesting that it only happens in manuscripts with Theophylacts commentary associated with it. I think I pulled one up. Here's one. It's hard to see. Let me see if I can find a nice page. I'm not going to bother trying to read this. I'll just embarrass myself. But yeah, so there's usually like squiggly marks where the New Testament text is. And then where the squiggly marks aren't is where the commentary is. So lots of commentary. So we have commentary. Let me make that nice and big. So we have commentary all the way through here. And then we get to here, and this indicates that this is scripture. Or maybe I vice versa that. I can't remember. But there's a definite distinction between the text that is scripture and the text that is commentary. Why this is interesting is because when we see the specific mistake, so if I go back to my notes here, right? Remember that the omission is both verse 44 and 46. There are no other manuscripts other than Theophylacts commentaries where they also skip over 45. And you can see the reason that they skip over 45 is because the similarities between what would be 44 and what becomes verse 47. So maybe I can explain this. If I pull open, so this looks the same as this, okay? And then in verse 48, it's the same. So you see what's happening here is a scribe, when he skips out on verse 44, he skips out on verse 46, but he skips out on verse 45 as well. So while he's copying, he sees these guys and attaches them to these guys here and skips a whole ton of stuff, right? Or you can see where he skips here, because they're all the same, and he comes to verse 47. In one instance, he comes straight to 48. So because it's very similar, you can see how the moving of the eye over one of these versus the other may cause you to skip an entire bit of text. And I think in Theophylacts commentary, whoever copied one of them over did this, and it has a family of Theophylact manuscripts that contain this specific variant where verse 44, 45, and 46 are missing. Now, the question is, right, again, it comes down to, well, how do you explain its removal versus how do you explain its addition? You can't explain its addition. You have to explain its removal, because out of all of the other manuscripts that contain Theophylacts commentary, aside from those that I showed you, they all contain 44, 45, and 46. So when you look at the evidence here, okay, of these guys being shown as examples of where verse 44 and 46 do not exist, these really shouldn't be used as witnesses for them, because they're showing an archetype of a manuscript copied for Theophylacts commentary, which is clearly an error. So these are not witnesses either for or against. Probably for, because every other manuscript with Theophylacts commentary contains it. Now, they don't occur in all of Theophylacts manuscripts. I got a list here. And I haven't gone through and collated and checked every single one of them, because there are quite a few here. But the sense that I'm getting is, of this list, the ones that contain Mark have both 44 and 46, and 45. So these manuscripts here, the ones that omit 44, 45, and 46, they're, again, specific to Theophylacts commentary and specific to these ones specifically. Now I had got in touch with Joey McCallum, because I heard his name. I was speaking with someone about this. I think it was yesterday or the day before. Yeah, and Joey's name came up, so I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, you did some work and you discovered some stuff about commentary manuscripts." And it turns out that there is actually a subtype, like a text type, kind of, Alexandrian, Byzantine. So the Byzantine text is not just like one monolithic type, right? Like it's subdivided into a number of families, and the work was pioneered by von Soden in the was it the late 1800s, and he came up with a whole bunch of text families. Now his work was somewhat inadequate, right? He's working by himself, made a bunch of mistakes and stuff like that. But there's been some work to try to categorize manuscripts, and two of the big ones that come up today is, one was the Claremont profile method. Frederick Wiese, I have his book around here somewhere. I was taking a look at it the other day, but he kind of came up with a solution for classifying manuscripts based on readings in Luke 1, Luke 10, and Luke 20. And so he collated every manuscript that he could find on Luke 1, 10, and 20, and came up with a list of families. So he divided that into 16 subtypes. Now, relatively recently, Bruce Morrill did some work with John 18. So I talked to Joey McCallum and said, "Can you pull up some manuscripts in John's profile and 18?" And he said, "Oh yeah, easily. There's a clear grouping there in John 18 in Theophylacts commentaries." So he gave me those manuscripts, and what I have here is a list of all those minuscules right here. So I set out, I started, but I haven't finished. I'll probably continue with this process at some point to check these manuscripts, and none of the manuscripts that do not contain 44, 45, and 46, none of those appear in this list. So what I'm assuming is, every time we have the book of Mark in this list of manuscripts that have this Theophylact family in John 18, are representative of a family type that comes from the Theophylact commentary manuscripts. And so they all contain, as far as I know, I haven't checked all of them, but they include verse 44 and 46. And 45, of course. It's very difficult. Okay, it's very difficult to pinpoint exact manuscript verses in the minuscules when they are not indexed and when they are not transcribed. And I don't think many of these are indexed and transcribed. Now, what's interesting is, if you look at this list, manuscript 732 is of interest here, because he sent me the list and he said, "Oh, no, you got to take manuscript 732 out of the list because it's outside the profile." Just barely, but it's outside the profile. And so when I took a look at 732, which is just barely outside of the Theophylact commentary, check it out. It is right here. 732 does not contain verse 44, 45, and 46. All this to say, this is super, I got it in my head. I know how it works in my head. Hard to get it out. But all this to say that the family archetype of Theophylact's commentary text, not his commentary, but the New Testament text in the commentary, is swayed towards including verse 44, 45, and 46. So when we come back to these manuscripts here highlighted in yellow, which omit 44, 45, and 46, again, probably because of some sort of parablepsis. These really should not be, at least I don't see it. I would be interested in James and Heaven, your opinion on this, but I don't think we should consider these Theophylact manuscripts as either for or against the readings for Mark 44 and 46. Again, because these seem to come from an exemplar which actually contained the verses, and somebody somewhere messed up by skipping an entire block of text there, which makes sense that bigger blocks of text would be easier to miss when you're copying it from a commentary, because you're focused on both the text and the commentary. And the question would be, right, if you're copying a commentary manuscript, what are you more likely to favor? Are you more likely to favor the commentary or the New Testament text of the commentary? That would be interesting. That's an interesting question. I don't have the answer to, but there's lots of neat things there. So yeah, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 items that are in the ECM as listed for support for the omission of verse 44 and 46. Those should probably be removed. That would be my guess now. I don't have credentials, so I can't just go and start removing things. So it would be up to somebody who has credentials to look at that and go do the work. So what this gets down to, there's so many lessons in this one. This is so exciting. Is when you're looking at a list of manuscripts to see whether or not a reading is supported or not, just a superficial look at the manuscript witness numbers isn't really good enough, right? If there's anything that we learned today, it's that we could take probably these Theophylact manuscripts, and had I not gone in and actually checked them and taken a look at them, we wouldn't have seen that they weren't actually witnesses either for or against, including these two passages. In fact, I would probably lean toward having these be support slightly more for, just because the rest of Theophylacts manuscripts seem to contain these verses. So anyway, that's the lesson. You got to dig a little deeper. You can't just look at a superficial list of numbers. So going forward, as we look at these verses, I'll be taking a little bit of a closer look at some of the minuscules and the manuscripts and such. So yeah, we may not get all the details of everything in one video, but you know what? That's okay. We're in it for the long haul, right? All right.